Okay, we're back with Michael Ventura, and last time we were describing Lubbock and the scene around a group of guys that came to be known as the Flatlanders, Butch Hancock and Joe Ely and a couple of other guys that were musicians that he hooked up with, and the crowd around them, and we were attempting to give a description of that group and that scene around them, and so you had gone back east for a wedding and then returned to Lubbock, and I think that's where we are chronologically. So if you just want to take it from there.
Okay, this is a very interesting group of people in that they're all Texans. Most of them have grown up in Lubbock or in the Texas Panhandle, and they came from fairly working class people. It was a town where a working class person could work hard and easily buy a nice little place. And live that kind of a life where you could own your own home and all in a decent neighborhood. At the same time, it used to be not true anymore because the town's about 4 times the size of what it was 50 years ago. But it used to be called. They used to say it had a church on every corner, which was a bit of an exaggeration, but not that much of an exaggeration. And so it was a very repressive society if you were not a rebellious teenager, but just kind of a curious teenager. And there was the university, Texas Tech, which really is the center of the town, employs most of the people. Now it has its own hospital. It is the heart of the town. I would imagine that about a third of the employment is through Texas Tech and its adjacent hospitals and such and such. And so these people, they were all people who, as I said last time, use the phrase of Butch Hancock's, are free spirits. Jimmy Dale Gilmore had a big influence on everybody because he would usually be the first to read some way out book and bring it to the attention of other people with all his enthusiasm. Joe Ely was maybe the most musically schooled in that he had really assimilated into his style and into his playing a mix of blues, country, and rock. Butch Hancock had incredible flights of imagination and the most prolific of the composers of the three of them. And as I said, and just to emphasize, we weren't hippies, we weren't bohemians, I don't know what we were, but the worst vice we had was coffee and cigarettes, some of us, but not all of us. And this was a really drug-free and practically alcohol-free scene, not out of any kind of, nobody talked about it. It wasn't what we did. Yeah. It wasn't a decision. It just wasn't who we were.
My strong impression from being around those guys was like a Sun Records kind of rockabilly era. Mm-hmm. Was a very strong influence on those guys and how they did their hair and talked and this kind of sense of humor that they had.
Yes. And they came out of that definitely. And I think I was telling you about the Cotton Club. Buddy Holly and Carl Perkins and Elvis Presley, before they had hit records, all played the Cotton Club. And so, and they're my contemporaries. I was born in 45. So they're like 10, 11, 12, 13, and this amazing music is going on. And Wolfman Jack was broadcasting out of Del Rio on a radio station that would blare the thing. It was broadcast all over the place late at night. And they'd be listening to that. Excuse me. was their music school. And that in the country, the Grand Ole Opry, all that stuff, Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, all that stuff combined. And spiritually, as I said, some of them were the Hancocks, who weren't related to Butch Hancock. Tommy and Charlene Hancock and their kids, Tracy and Connie and Holly and Joaquin and a couple others that I'm missing the names of right now. They were more, and Charlene especially, was more into the Christian mysticism. But they all, except for Butch and Joe and me, almost everybody there became, during that winter, devotees of Guru Maharaj Ji. And that kind of swept in like a big wind. And Jimmy Dale especially, and other of our friends there. And Jimmy Dale and his people went up to Colorado, where the headquarters of all that was. And with Jimmy's spiritual development over the years, he and Janet became very deep and still are into Tibetan Buddhism, to where Janet is one of the only people sanctioned by the temple in Tibet to teach this sect of Buddhism in this country.
Wow.
Joe and Sharon later got very, very into Native American religion and practices, and Jeanette did too. Butch and I were always kind of the agnostics of all this, and didn't get deep into either of those things, but had our own deal. We did of metaphysical investigation. And by the end of that first year, Jeanette, who had been with Butch for about 5 years, was living at that place, 14th Street. She had known she called him a psychic named George. And that was a big mystery to us, because she'd talk about George, and we got all these weird first impressions of George from Jeanette. And one day, when Butch and Jeanette and I and the Debbie we called Little Debbie in those days, Debbie Fields, and a couple other people, we were sitting around 14th, and everybody else was off away on travels. And Jeanette comes and says, George is here. And I didn't know what to expect, but I came out, and there was a guy who kind of looked like a used car salesman. he was dressed kind of snazzy, and he was about 50. You know, we were all more or less 30. I was 28, and so Butch would have been 28, and Jeanette would have been about 30. And he had a great big car, Cadillac or a Lincoln or something, and very, very bright eyes, and but laid back for all that. He was very intense, but laid back. And we all talked through the night. For one thing, he took us to what was the name of that place? It was a great cafeteria-style restaurant, and I'm not thinking of it. It began with an F. It was a classic place of the day, and to buy us all dinner. And we hadn't all had a hot restaurant meal in a long time. Food, yeah, unlimited food. And the weird part was he drove that Lincoln, let's call it, about 3 miles an hour to go to this place. It took us about 25 minutes, and it was practically around the corner. And the weirder part was none of us said anything. You'd think one of us, it's not like we were shy people that way, one of us would have said, George, why are we driving like 2.5 miles an hour? But nobody did. And everybody just continued the conversation. George was just kind of draped over the driving wheel, going at about 2.5, 3.5 miles an hour. And I'm not exaggerating. It took like 20 minutes to get to this place that we could have walked to in that time. And we're all talking, and then we go back, and we're talking some more about all kinds of things. And I'm really trying to keep this on low volume as I speak about it, because I don't want to sound crazy. But fun night. And then George said, well, who's coming with me? Because he lived up in Clarendon. And none of us did that night, but he left, and we started comparing notes about what he said, and we each remembered totally different things. I'm just saying it like it happened. I'm not drawing any conclusions, but we each remembered completely different things that were important to us, of things that said and that happened. And when we put them all together, they didn't contradict each other. Bush said, well, he said this and this. And I go, yeah, I guess he did. But didn't he say this and this? And then Bush said, oh, yeah, I didn't think of that. Yeah, he did. And that kind of way. And so he and his wife, Dixie, had a place up in Clarendon, Texas. Tiny little town, 1,200 people. And suddenly Butch and Jeanette just decided to go there. And, okay. And then I stayed in Lubbock for a while. I was in love with a girl named Kathy. And she was crazy into, I don't mean crazy into, she was intensely into this Guru Maharaji stuff. And I was intensely not into this Guru Maharaji stuff. And finally we had to break up over it. It was like she was going with Guru Maharaji and heading up to Colorado, and I was not. And so I went up to Clarendon, and there Butch and I worked for George. Now Butch is probably, don't say probably, he is the most brilliant person I know who's contemporary to me. In terms of this all-around brilliance of conceptual thinking, and at the same time, he could build a house from the ground up. He almost had a degree in architecture, but left college about a month before graduation for a reason I never knew. And he can do all that. He's an amazing artist, visual artist, especially just pen and ink drawings. He is an incredible photographer. He could put out books and books of photography. He's got all these photographic files that'll probably make an amazing archive. And he's a songwriter, and right up there with the best songwriters, his best stuff. And he and I would have these conceptual discussions around for years, into the night. We'd meet when we were in Austin later on, we'd meet at an all-night cafe. There was a Nighthawk. There were 2 or 3 Nighthawks in Austin. And I throw down my notebook on the table, and he threw down his, and we'd have our pens, and we start talking. And for instance, we got on this long conceptual thing that carried on through many conversations over a couple of years about Jesus being a goddess, about Jesus being, and we didn't mean this derogatory at all, but Jesus being the most feminine male in Western iconography. Come unto me, I am meek and mild, and my burden is light. Suffer the children to come unto me, turn the other cheek. If they take your cloak, give them your shirt. I am here for the forgiveness of sins, forgiving people, healing people. This was not in any way censored, any kind of way. The macho prophet, even if you want to call it that. This incredibly gentle, if you read the Gospels, especially the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, this incredibly gentle figure. Yes, he gets angry every once in a while. Who doesn't? But he heals people without saying, are you a good person? He just heals them. And he goes around and preaches his stuff, and then takes a little walk on the water. And we looked at him as look at all his feminine aspects. And yet he is the most well-known male in the Western iconography. If you're just stepping back from the religions, you're not even talking about the religious aspect. You're looking at who is the most well-known male in the Western iconography, who does so much of Western thought revolve around, and you come to this person, and when you read the Gospels, you step back, and you're not in a religious frame of mind. You're just, who is this guy? It is a very feminine valence. I don't know how else to put it. And so when we say things like Jesus is God, people would thought we were out of our minds or being really disrespectful, but we weren't. Mm-hmm. We were really trying to figure this cat out. But with Butch, I'd have those kinds of conversations, and Butch would go on trains of thought that I could understand while he was talking, but that I wasn't smart enough to retain. Like, even if I made notes, what the heck does this mean? But made total sense when he was talking about it. And so it's kind of, I was smart enough to understand him and not smart enough to really get him in a lot of things. But so we were up in Clarendon, and we were building things. George would say, I'm going to build a building over there. And the only thing I know about building a building, as you well know, is hammering nails and mixing cement. I couldn't do what these guys could do. I don't even like being on top of a ladder. But I was as helpful as I could be. Somebody's got to mix the cement. Somebody's got to hammer the nails. And we built a bar. And then we ran the bar. We built an amphitheater. And then we put on a couple of plays and stuff in the amphitheater. The little college, the community college there, the drama teacher heard I was a writer and asked George if I could write a play about the last week of Jesus' life. And I went, I'd never written a play before, but I was supposed to be a writer, so yeah, I guess I can do that. And I read the Gospels and I put together this thing. And she had to show it to every minister in Darling County. And all these fundamentalist ministers to get it approved, or she couldn't put it on to college, so nobody would let her. And they made me change two things. I had Jesus dance at the wedding of Cana, and the Baptists say dancing is a sin, so he couldn't dance. And I had Mary Magdalene pick up the ear of the guard that Peter cut the ear off of in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they said, no, Jesus heals that ear. Mary Magdalene can't pick it up. but the rest of it, they did. And then this woman, her name was Norma, asked if I could, oh yeah, by the way, could you direct the play? and maybe you could play a part in the play. So I ended up, she directed the production and I directed the acting. We got a Jesus, a wonderful young guy, who happened to be the first pot bust in Donnelly County. So he played Jesus.
Was this before or after the play?
No, before.
Oh.
Before. He was on parole. And I played Pontius Pilate, because I had to give myself a good role, where you get some talking in.
Yeah.
And there was a cowboy named Roy, and he played the high priest of the Jews, because there was a hymn he could sing. He had an incredible voice. He was a tiny guy, but he had an incredible voice. And the drama class, known as drama class, played all these various parts. And Butch Hancock took a lot of photos. We staged a crucifixion up on the cliffs and took photos of that were projected in the theater. Oh. And man, they look real. They look real. And Joe Ely came through, and I don't know where he learned how to do this, but he constructed a light board and he ran lights on the play. And it was called Jesus the Man. We had 2 performances, 2 nights, costumes, everything. Of course, in the night or two before a performance, everything is chaotic. Everybody thinks it's all going to flop, but you just run around doing it and you get through it. And the theater had just been built at the community college, had about 500 seats. There were only about 1,500, maybe 2,000 people in all of Loudoun County, and half of them came to the play. We had a full house each night.
That's great.
And it was great. It really was. And I'd go into a store after that, and a cashier would say, "Well, I don't like you. You're Pontius Pilate." So it was, and something people don't, that the commentators and such really don't get about rural America is, these people don't have horns and tails. They're just people.
Yeah.
and they accepted me. I had to clean up my act in terms of, they didn't like my cursing. I was, still fresh out of the East, and I used more curse words than I would now. And they got me on that, and I apologized and cleaned up my act on that. But they were, and they'd ask me, "Why doesn't Jeanette wear a bra?" I'd say, "Well, I don't really know. You'd have to ask her that. I'm not sure." And one fellow, I was at a diner, and he said, "You work with Dr. Howard." Now, why they called him Dr. Howard, I don't know. I don't think George ever graduated high school. He went into the Navy when he was too young to be legally admitted. He was only 16.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what was George's occupation?
Well,
okay.
We were in the Lincoln, and we were going somewhere, me and George and Butch, and we got gas up at a little town called Groom on I-40 Route 66, and the kid pumping gas, because in those days they came out and pumped gas.
Right.
You didn't pump yourself. And the kid looked at George and said, "Mister, what do you got to do to get a car like this?" And George went, "A little of this and a little of that." The kid said, "That's what I thought." So now George was a complicated figure. When he died, I wrote an obit in the Austin Chronicle, and I said, there are some said he was a wise man. Some said he was a con man. Both views are supported by the facts. And that was true. He was a wise man, and he was a con man. And I found out things that I didn't want to know. That would lead me now, if I were writing about it, if I was honest, to say, I wouldn't call George a good man. He was a good friend to me, and a good teacher of life. But he did some things I can't condone, and that I don't want to say in this medium when he's not here to defend himself.
Of course not.
But we had our disagreements even back then in the bar and everything. He was making deals with the organized crime figures in that area, believe it or not, for this and for that, and I just didn't want any part of it. And after a year, I left. I didn't end my friendship with George by any means, but in a personal way, I trusted George, and in a not personal way, I did not trust George. But I'm saying this as a backup to a remarkable story I'm about to tell you. That is true, cross my heart and spit, but it I don't expect it to be believed. And this is the kind of thing that George especially taught Butch. I wasn't interested in learning this part of it, but I learned a lot about esoteric things. So, a friend of ours from Snyder, Texas, named Ron, was a classical pianist, and a very good classical pianist. Had been in a bunch of competitions, had often come in second, and he was mystified by that because he said, if you come in second, you come in first, and I don't know why I'm not coming in first. So he spent a few weeks with us, and to honor him and to give him something to do, George got a baby grand piano delivered from Amarillo. Now George had taken the house at the highest point. This is flat prairie land. You remember it. At the highest point in Clarendon, Texas. It had been a big house, 3-story house. And he had gutted it completely. And so that each floor was like a deck around the big emptiness of the center of the house. And he had made a enormous bookcase that went from the cellar to the tip of the attic to the roof in the form of an A with all books, but you had to climb on that bookcase to get the books. It was dangerous. I was at a diner, and a kid said to me, "Mister, you work for Mr. Howard?" And I said, "Yeah." "Is it true?" Dr. Howard, he called him. "Is it true about that bookcase?" And he described the bookcase, and I said, "Yeah." He says, "Is it true Dr. Howard can just raise his hand, and any book he wants comes to his hand?" And I said, "Well, I've never seen that." So I can't tell you that that's true. But who knows? Those are the kind of things that stories that grew up around George. And yet they were not quite without foundation. I'm sure that one was without foundation. But so there's this piano, and there's these 2 piano movers. Now, George had hollowed out, as I said, the center of the house, keeping the basic structural, but the second floor was just kind of a deck around the center. The third floor was kind of a deck. And he had a 45-degree angle staircase going from the first floor to the second, about 1.5 yards wide, no banister. And those guys with the piano were looking at the piano, looking at the staircase, and they don't want to bring it up there. And they're just 2 guys. And George said, "That's okay, we're going to do it." And I look at Ron, I'm not a very big guy, and at the time I was like 125 pounds, and he was skinnier than I was. And George said, "Ventura, you and Ron get, I'll get the top, you guys get the bottom." And we're looking at each other like, "Are you crazy?
Yeah.
We can't carry this goddamn thing up these stairs." But we didn't say anything. We just went, and he got the bottom. It felt like a piano. We're getting it to the stairs. We get to the stairs. He's on top. He says, "Okay, lift." And we lift it, and it didn't weigh anything. I remember looking at Ron, and Ron's looking at me. I'm on with my right shoulder. He's with his left shoulder. We're facing each other as we're guiding this piano up because it didn't weigh anything. And we're just looking at each other going, "What the hell is going on?" And the guys, the piano movers, are just like their eyes are popping out. How are these guys doing this? And George is just kind of guiding it from the top. And then we put it down. And it's a piano. It's a real piano. It's right there. It's not hollowed out or anything like that. There's no trick. And they leave. And we asked George, "What just happened?" And he said something very vague, like, "Oh, you'd think I'd remember." He said something vague, something that didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like, "Oh, it just happened. Oh, we could just do that," kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't going to tell us. But if you have an experience that, for whatever reason and however it happened, the laws of gravity just didn't work on this at that time, it changes you. Mm-hmm. Not that you reject science. I don't mean that at all.
Right.
But you understand, because you've experienced, whether anybody believes you or not, that the law of gravity has exceptions. Don't ask me how. Now, Butch learned how to George will call it levitate, great weights of rocks. George levitated great weights of rocks, not with me around. But I'd see the result, and I'd see all of us together couldn't have carried that boulder.
Yeah.
But there the boulder was. It had moved from here to there.
Mm-hmm.
And being aware that this sort of thing could be. And, I'm sure a bunch of people out there won't believe me, but it happened.
No, I believe you. I think that, things like the pyramids, people still haven't
exactly.
figured those kind of things out. And
the pyramids, Stonehenge.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gradually realized that George came from a tradition that's very ancient. He was taught the way he was more or less teaching us. If you name it, you're not of it, was the distinct impression I got. He never said it, but that was another way he taught. He wasn't. You had to figure it out for yourself. He put you in the situation where it was there to figure out, but you had to do your own defining. And my clear impression was that if you called it anything, you just weren't going to get any more information. And I wasn't interested in learning what Butch in part learned. But I did learn a lot about how energies operate between people.
Mm-hmm.
I did learn a lot about that. Without him consciously teaching me.
I kind of interrupted you when you were giving a little bit of George's history. You said he was in the military or World War II.
He was in the Navy. He had a ship torpedoed under him in the Pacific. A lot of guys killed by sharks. He operated a landing craft in one of the. My impression was that it was Tarawa, but that's my impression. He saw a lot of guys killed around him, like hundreds of guys killed around him.
Yeah, sounds like my grandpa.
In one afternoon. And my impression was after that he was never afraid of anybody. But he found his teacher when he was in a hospital in the Pacific, recovering from wounds. And Dixie said he came back from the war a very different person. Now, while I have the attention on George, I need to talk about Dixie. Now, these people were with me until they died. Dixie died about 2008 at the age of about 91, and George died 2011 at the age of about 89, 90. And Dixie, she didn't talk much. She taught at the school. She taught Spanish and English. George was universally avoided by the people of Donnelly County. Dixie was just as universally respected. I was going up to visit their graves with Jasmine. It was October 2014. And because I would always go up, if I could, to visit Dixie, whether George was there or not, and we'd watch the World Series. And we didn't care who won. We just liked being together watching the World Series.
Yeah.
And we were in the fried chicken place, the Dairy Queen, and there was a couple there, younger than me, more or less Jasmine's age, and they were eating, and the guy, the gentleman said, looked at us and smiled. No kind of, rural malevolence that you see in the movies all the time. Just looked and smiled and said, "You folks look like you're a long way from home." His friendly way of saying, "You're not from around here, are you?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Yeah, but I lived in this town about 30 years ago, 40 years ago." I said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. I was working for the Howards." And I come back year after year to visit Dixie Howard. I'm here now to visit her grave. And both of them changed completely. And the woman said, we were in Dixie's class at the college here. And Dixie Howard was a fine human being. And Dixie meant the world to me. Dixie, I get chills thinking of her. Dixie was one of those people, she's quiet. She didn't have a philosophy. She wasn't going to tell you, she wasn't going to do magic, except her biscuits were magic. She made great biscuits. And she wasn't demonstrative, but she had a presence that people remembered, like those two people. And she was just, she was kind of a definition of a fine human being. And she was very important to me. George was important to me one way, but Dixie was important to me as my standard in terms of right and wrong. And you know, I figured if I was ashamed to tell Dixie something, I must not feel good about it. and I'd be kind of embarrassed when she read my stuff because I knew that she wouldn't approve of a bunch of it. But she would say, I'm just reading it because you wrote it. And let it go at that. And a kind of person who's never famous, who's never in history books, who's never made much of. But if you know that kind of person, fortunate enough to know that a kind of person like that in your life, there's a lot of things it opens a door to of how to assess yourself and what you're doing and all of this. And we didn't agree. We never talked about it, but we didn't agree politically. We didn't, it wasn't that was small. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That was just small. We never thought enough of politics to even explore that avenue. We didn't care.
Yeah.
But our bond gave each of us strength, and she got to where she couldn't take care of herself, and George was not able to take care of her, and there was a little old folks home on the edge of town. It was clean. It was well managed. Even the food was good, because those people, their families were right there in Donley County visiting every day. If they weren't going to tolerate any what you hear about old people's homes and stuff. It was just sweet, actually. And sometime when I'd visit up there, last 3 or 4 years of her life, she was there, and I'd stay in a hotel, and I'd come about mealtime, and she'd be sitting with folks, and I never called first. We never did that, ever, any of us, that whole time.
Yeah.
People just showed up.
Yeah.
And she'd make a place for me. She was in a walker and all that. She couldn't, but she'd have a place made for me at the table. She'd introduce me to the other people. I'd eat with them. And I'd go to her room that she shared with somebody else and had a curtain in between. And we'd talk. And after about 15 minutes, she'd repeat something she said 15 minutes ago. So what? She was still just as sharp, and gently funny, and so I didn't want these reminiscences to pass without mentioning Dixie Howard, because that's the salt of the earth, and you got to remember there are people like that.
Yeah.
And you can count yourself fortunate to know one or two in your life. After a year in Clarendon, I had a kind of major disagreement. We didn't speak for another 2 years. But so I left. A major but friendly disagreement. It was no animosity. It was just, look, I ain't going to do this. And him, okay, you're not going to do this. And I'm leaving. He said, okay. Say goodbye to Dixie. Told her I'd be visiting, and I always did. And first I headed to Lubbock. I guess I hitchhiked. I didn't have a car or anything. And it was just in time to see Joe Ely play the Main Street Saloon with his new band, which he'd formed, and that became the Joe Ely Band that became famous in the 70s and early 80s. And then caught a ride with somebody down in Austin. And I was sleeping on the couch of a friend, the piano player's friend, Ron, the piano player. The pianist, actually, because he's a classical piano guy.
Yeah.
And this was the kind of life that was. You know, people would come later and before and be friends of friends, and I'd give them a place to stay.
Right.
You know, as you well remember. And so this guy lived in Austin around 45th Street and Airport, and I slept on the sofa, and Ron comes in, and I'm there a couple of days, exploring the town, walking all over, walking miles and miles. And it was a green town then, no skyscrapers, more trees than I'd ever seen, and it didn't have sidewalks in a lot of places. And coming from the East Coast, what do you mean? This is the capital of the state. How do you not have sidewalks? And it was really in another country, it was like, because we've never heard of a city without sidewalks. Lubbock had sidewalks, for Christ's sake. I mean, how could the capital of the state not have sidewalks?
Yeah.
But they didn't. And so he brings in the first edition, the first copy, the first issue is the word I'm looking for, of the Austin Sun. And he said, Michael, you're a writer? These guys need writers. So I called up, and somebody answered the phone and said, well, come on down, this guy Jeff Nightbird, well, come on down tomorrow. And I had written, a year before that in Lubbock, before I went up to Clarendon, I had written about a 100-page essay on what I thought was happening in the world, just for my own. I wasn't looking to get it published or anything. I didn't know how to get anything published. And I had written this essay. It was the only example of writing I had that this guy could possibly be interested in. And I walked all the way from 45th down to 15th, and like 45th in Airport to 15th in Guadalupe. And my essay under my arm. It's about 4 miles, and there I am, about 122 pounds, rotten 3 front teeth, wild-haired white guy who, as I said, a lot of people in Texas didn't think I was white. And there's this guy, Jeff Nightbird, with a beard, sitting behind a desk, but the office is total chaos. And he said, well, we can't talk here. Let's go down to the parking lot. And it was a parking lot of a 7-Eleven. The 7-Eleven's still there. There's a skyscraper where the Austin Sun used to be, but the 7-Eleven's still there. And he looks at the first page of my essay, opens it up to the middle, reads a little, opens up, goes to the last page, reads a little. He said, well, you can write. Oh, no, but before this, we're standing at the desk upstairs. It was at the top floor of a 2-story residential place, and it was in chaos. There were people doing all kinds of things, all kinds of people. There were like 4 rooms or 5 rooms. They're all crowded, and there's different kinds of putting out of paper machinery and instruments and all this stuff. And where we couldn't have a conversation there. We had to go down to the parking lot. And but he said when I got up there, he said, I'm Ventura, blah, blah, blah. We called. He said, can you write? And I said, yeah, I can write. later he told me that he always asked the same question when people came in, or if they wanted to work, whatever. Can you write? And he said, I was the only one who said, yeah, I can write. Other people said, I try to write, I want to write, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But I was kind of audacious. So I said, yeah, I can write. And then in the parking lot, he says, well, you can write, after he looks at my stuff. What do you know? And I said, very arrogantly, with total audacion, I am 28 years old and uneducated in a formal way. And I totally exaggerated my experience. And I said, well, I know politics, but I don't want to write about politics. And he said, no, we got to write about politics. I said, I know movies. Now, this is only because I watched so many movies on TV, and I went to all these movies. It's not like I had a degree or anything like that. He said, no, we got a film critic. I said, I know theater. I've been an actor. Well, I paid Pontius Pilate to clear into Texas. So I wasn't lying, but I wasn't really telling the truth. And he said, okay, you're the theater critic. We go upstairs, phone rings, and he picks it up. He says, talk to our theater critic. He hands me the phone. It was a little theater on 6th Street called the Creek Theater, near the creek on 6th Street. And they had, it was a brave little theater. They were going to do a production of Edgar Lee Masters' Graveyard Poems. I can't remember the name of it at the moment. And it was going to be a production, a one-man show of Woody Guthrie, a guy doing Woody Guthrie. The production was very, very good of the Edgar Lee Masters. The guy doing Woody Guthrie was great. I went to both shows, and I was going to get paid $15 a printed page. So I wrote everything I could think of, because I was totally broke. I wrote everything I could think of about these plays.
Yeah.
And took up 2 printed pages, got paid $35. It came out on October 31st, 1974, my 29th birthday. And when he was looking at the copy, he gave me a little job on the side as a proofreader, which is a joke because I need proofreaders. My stuff could only get printed because I had good proofreaders. But he calls me up at this place where I'm proofreading, and he says, well, you're obviously the best writer who's walked in here. I'm going to print the whole thing. And I'll tell you this, and I don't think I've ever written this down. I can't remember, but I don't think I have. I went to the men's room of the place that they'd rented to do the proofreading and printing and typesetting. And I looked in the mirror, and I smiled at myself.
Yeah.
I just grinned at myself. Because I had a feeling, based on nothing, that this was it, that I was on my way.
Yeah.
And I earned my living that way for the next 40 years.
That's great. Well, do you want to stop there for tonight?
Yeah, this is a good place. It's a good place to stop.
Okay, great. All right.